was 11 years old the first time I saw someone murdered in front of me. I was 11 years old when I found my grandmother dead on the kitchen floor. I was afraid, I felt alone, and I was angry. I was 11 years old when I was suspended from school. I was 11 years old the first time I was arrested. I wish someone would have asked me if I was okay. I know what it feels like to be rejected, kicked out, suspended, expelled, asked to leave, divorced, locked up, and placed in solitary confinement. I was left back in kindergarten, left back again in the 7th grade. I spent 3 years in the 9th grade, and I was pushed out of high school after the 11th grade into prison. I'm a prison survivor, a son, a father, a brother, a neighbor, a healer, a storyteller, and again, a prison survivor. I'm a community epidemiologist and a community-based participatory researcher. And what that means is that I've learned to listen to people and encourage and support you in telling your own story rather than telling your story for you, rather than commodifying, publishing, and benefiting off of creating solutions for people that can create solutions for themselves. We live in a society where 3.5 million children are suspended every year. 2.4 million people are incarcerated, and 7 million people are under some form of criminal justice control in any given moment. And over 50% of all marriages end in divorce. Rejection, zero tolerance, retribution, and violence are the imperatives of our time. I encourage you to imagine a world where radical welcome, forgiveness, healing, and restorative practices are our way. A world in which we always look for the alternatives to the harshest punishments. A world in which we recognize that hurt people, and that surviving trauma impacts decision-making, brain development, and we create a community where people can show up as their best selves and always be present. I worked in a juvenile justice facility with a young man named Kareem. He was a beautiful, brilliant, and charismatic young man. And Pennsylvania requires that any child that's sentenced for a violent crime write a victim impact letter before being released. Kareem vehemently refused to write that letter, extending his stay for months and possibly years. When I started working with Kareem as his therapist, I asked him why. Why the resistance? Why the refusal to write the letter? And Kareem told me story after story of growing up in an abusive home, of living in a violent community where he had to fight bullies every day to get home safe. And he said to me with tears in his eyes, "Ain't nobody write me no damn letter or care about me all the times that I was a victim." And it made me research and realize that over 60% of violent offenders have been victims of crime. Imagine a world where Kareem and children like him were asked, "How can I help?" rather than rejected, kicked out, locked up, or thrown away for expressing their pain. Imagine if they were greeted with radical welcome. Imagine if Kareem was greeted with a radical welcome that affirmed his greatness, that affirmed that he belonged, and that reminded him that he was connected to a community that loved him and believed in his best self. Radical welcome greets you with a radiating smile. It takes the time to learn your name, and perhaps the most radical part, it forgives you and welcomes you back into the community when you do harm and don't show up as your best self. I knew the first thing we had to do was implement a no eject, no reject policy at the facility. A policy that states you are more than the worst thing that you've ever done. A policy that states that we know that you will not always show up as your best self, but we will not vote you off the island. A policy that states that you are greater than your bad days. My colleagues and I intentionally created a space where accountability and judgment could coexist. A space where Kareem and youth like him could share their pain and their experiences and at times act out and not be othered or voted off the island. What we learned is that lessons like compassion, respect, forgiveness, and empathy are not taught, they're modeled. Modeled through radical welcome that creates connectivity and safety and a sense of belonging. And we know that when people feel welcomed, they show up different. When I was at my worst, Mama Batts would lean down and whisper in my ear, "Baby, when you decide to put half of the energy you put into doing wrong into doing the right thing, you're gonna change the world." When I was at my worst and I got a little bigger, she would tippy-toe and reach up to me and say, "Boy, When you decide to do put half of the energy you put into doing the wrong thing, into doing the right thing, you're gonna change the world. Everyone needs a Mama Batts in their life that will see past our errors and see greatness in us and tell us our true story. But Mama Batts wasn't enough to keep me safe because I was born into a world that hated me and rejected me. And naturally, it taught me to hate myself. When our children attend schools with police officers instead of counselors, when they're followed around stores, suspended, judged, and further rejected for expressing their pain, they will find welcome and belonging in other ways, often through gangs and crime and promiscuity and drugs. Tupac Shakur spoke for a whole generation of rejected urban youth when he said, "I hung around the thugs, and even though they sold drugs, they showed a young brother love." Even with a mother that stepped in when the rest of the world stepped out, I went astray, because we need a radical welcome that extends beyond that one caring adult that every child deserves. We need a community that internalizes and epitomizes that we all belong. We need a community where our worth and greatness are constantly being affirmed the moment we walk in the door to the moment that we leave. I recently spent 2 weeks in Senegal and learned firsthand about what's called Senegalese teranga. Teranga is a Wolof word that means extreme hospitality. There's no English equivalent because it's not here, it's here. It's the way you get off a plane and people embrace you like you've known them your whole life. And they smile and they tell you welcome home upon finding out that you're an African American. You know how we walk down the street facing our phone and ask someone, "How are you?" And we really don't care. We don't want to hear about their grocery list. We don't want to hear about their sciatica. And we definitely don't want to hear about their hemorrhoids. Well, in Senegal, teranga felt like a genuine interest and concern for my well-being. It felt like a sense of belonging when constantly welcomed with a smile, a warm embrace, or invited to share a large meal out of a bowl with strangers. Senegalese teranga didn't appear overnight. It was developed during times of colonialism and post-colonialism to fight the racism of the French. It was developed because the Senegalese, they knew that difference has the power to other us. And they knew that all the ethnic groups that were dealing with the oppression and white supremacy during that time from the French would split, and it would develop a hatred amongst them if they didn't begin to work together during the 15th and 20th centuries. The collective trauma of the Black Holocaust in Africa empowered the groups to join and to learn to create an identity that was centered around welcome so that difference did not set them apart. It is so ingrained and institutionalized in Senegal that their soccer team is called the Lions of Teranga. Leaders across Senegal knew this, and to this day, they stay committed to it, and you can feel it in everywhere you go, in everything they do, because they epitomize a radical welcome, and they showed me what it feels like to experience the 3 questions that are at the heart of it. How are you? Are you safe? Are you okay? I couldn't help but think about feelings of rejection I had experienced as a child and witnessing the countless youth and adults like Kareem in the detention centers, mental health facilities, and programs and community settings in which I worked and resided. And I wondered, what would our lives have been like had we been greeted with a radical welcome? Let me share a story of what radical welcome looks like in practice. Jose is a community college student that I learned about from his business professor while he was finishing a 14-year prison sentence for drug possession. His professor would call me every week and tell me about Jose's progress, about his 3.9, and that he wanted him to come to our agency when he returned home because we were the only ones that he felt would greet him and accept him the way that he needed to be accepted because he had spent half his life incarcerated and decades as a veteran gang member. The day Jose was released, his professor put him in the car and personally drove him to the center, where he was greeted with what? A radical welcome. He was greeted with that smile. He has been back every day since. He tutors youth. He walks youth home that are being bullied. He finishes his homework. He's a leader in our community because he's found a place where he can return. He's found a way that he can help the children and families in our community. And if you ask Jose, what did he find? He'd say he found a home. He'd tell you it's kind of like an episode of Cheers when Norm walks into the bar and everyone says, Norm! Imagine had Jose found radical welcome in school. Imagine had he been greeted with a smile and encouragement rather than being told he'd never amount to anything or that he'd die in a pool of his own blood in junior high school. The people, the places, and the ways in which we show up, they stick with us. And we often live up to the expectations of those that we encounter. Imagine how our youth and the most vulnerable amongst us would show up if we entered school, the library, and the mall, and we were treated like we belong. Like people were excited to see us. Like we had a place and we were a part of something larger than ourselves. Radical welcome heals. It warms and it inspires us to be our best. It increases accountability and it reminds us that we are bigger than something than just our own selves. Imagine a world in which we practice radical welcome rather than reinforcing the behaviors that lead to criminal activity in a search for belonging. Imagine a world where the police aren't being called on a neighbor for playing their music too loud, where someone needs a bathroom and can't afford to buy a cup of coffee and the police aren't being called, or a young black man with a hoodie on can eat a pack of Skittles in peace because he belonged. I work with an organization called the Promised Neighborhoods of the Lehigh Valley, and we're primarily led by volunteers that are formerly incarcerated, criminal justice involved, or have been impacted by the prison industrial complex. And what we learned in our work on our quest to help youth get from cradle to career is that safe and stable communities are critical to successful educational and life outcomes. We learned by surveying thousands of our community members, key stakeholder interviews, and focus groups with 120 of our neighbors that safety is of primary concern regardless of race, age, socioeconomic level, or zip code. And our theory was that by practicing radical welcome, by creating an environment that fosters a sense of belonging, we could decrease violence and increase a sense of belonging and perceptions on safety. Let me tell you what we learned from the 120 families that we did focus groups with. We learned that smiles matter, that names matter, and that greetings matter. We learned that people feel most welcome in places with friends and family, in doctors and dentist offices, in church, and in bodegas. We learned that when people feel welcome, they show up different. My research and work within vulnerable and oppressed communities has taught me that there are 3 critical questions that all of our neighbors in crisis often wish someone would ask. These 3 questions reinforce radical welcome. These 3 critical, caring, and compassionate questions sound kind of simple, and they are. It begins, again, with a smile. Not a regular smile, but an uncomfortably large smile. And by learning someone's name, it includes active listening, coming to know what's important to the people that we encounter, and the places that we show up every day. And it's how you treat people like Kareem, Jose, and me when we don't show up as our best selves. It's how we define our neighbors that have made mistakes. I, again, invite you to imagine what would it look like every day to show up in the places that you show up every day with a radical welcome in all that you do. Imagine a world where every child, every struggling adult, every neighbor in recovery has someone that believes in them, sees the best in them, and asks, are you okay? Are you safe? How can I help? Are you okay? Are you safe? How can I help? Are you okay? Are you safe? How can I help? Rejection, zero tolerance, and retribution are the imperatives of our time. I propose we reimagine a world centered in radical welcome, healing, forgiveness, restorative practices, a world in which mistakes can be made, a world in which mistakes are forgiven and allowed to be made.